It has been a commonly held belief that Soviet fighter designs have been very inferior to their Western counterparts. This is in some ways a half-truth. There is no doubt that from a technological and electronic standpoint that Soviet aircraft designs have been inferior. Yet, in other areas their aircraft have proven to be strong. They are often cheaper in comparison to their Western counterparts and simpler, which has led to easier support in the field. They also tend to be tougher, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, Soviet aircraft have always been of concern to NATO. One of the most infamous Soviet fighters to fly was the MiG-15. When it first appeared over the skies of Korea, it was the cause of a near-panic situation. The MiG was fast and manoeuvrable, armed with heavy guns and aggressive pilots. Many in the Western Air Forces had felt that the day of dogfighting was over. Consequently, their pilots were not as prepared as they should have been. The aggressive MiG pilots wanted to dogfight. The Western Allies were also under-equipped and still had many aircraft in service from the Second World War, including F-4U Corsairs, P-51 Mustangs and the B-29 Superfortress. These were some of the greatest planes in history, but they were not of the calibre of the MiG-15. It would not be until the F-86 Sabre entered the war that the MiG-15 found a worthy adversary. Militaries the world over seemed to be strongly opposed to originality and creative thinking, and the Soviets played this game as well as the West. The MiG-15's original designation was Project S. The S stood for swept because of its swept wing. To many people, the name MiG is connected to all Soviet fighters, and in fact the word MiG is an acronym of the last names of the Design Bureau's chief designers. There are several design bureaus as they didn't have companies. Mikoyan and Gurevich. The bureau was founded on Christmas Day 1939 and was called State Aircraft Factory 1. It was located on the outskirts of Moscow, and during the Second World War they only managed to get one fighter in production, the sleek MiG-3 fighter, but they had several other impressive designs. The MiG Bureau was considered an experimental rather than a production centre, and during the war years the VSS Soviet Air Force was dominated by Yak and LAV design bureaus. By war's end, MiG had examined captured planes as well as Western designs obtained through Lend-Lease. They were prepared to take chances with their designs. The other bureaus tended to play it safe and concentrated on trying to improve their existing designs. The Russian military was coming to the realization that updating existing designs was not always a viable option. They had followed that ideal leading into World War II and had found that many of their designs hopelessly outclassed by the far more modern German Bf-109Es. After the war, they were watching British and American designs and knew that the jet age required something new. Soviet power had often tried to downplay foreign involvement in their projects, as they preferred to herald everything as a Soviet achievement. However, they made great use of captured German hardware and documents. The plane they were most interested in was the TA-183 designed by the famous FW-190 designer Kurt Tank. The TA-183 was a single-engine jet of swept-wing design. Its wing was thin and at a 35-degree angle. When the government called for a new jet fighter, all three of the major bureaus were given the specs. This proved to be difficult, as the Soviets were just moving into the jet age. They had no engines of their own design, and originally were relying on copies of the German Jumo 004. When the option of using Rolls-Royce engines materialised, they took it, though it required major changes to the fuselage. The decision to sell the engines to Russia were not a popular one and met with severe disapproval from both the British Defence Ministry and the Royal Air Force. Over the course of 2 years, 1946 and 47, 55 engines were delivered. These engines were a mix of Derwent Mark Vs and Nene Mark Is. Both were of Rolls-Royce design. The prototype MiG-15 first flew on 30th December 1947 and was fitted with a Rolls-Royce engine. While the Soviet system had no companies, it didn't stop rivalries, and at times the competition between the different design bureaus was fierce. When the winter months proved more than troublesome for Mikoyan, he decided to move the fighter south to more favourable weather. The state acceptance trials were approaching, and it was vital to get as much airtime as possible to work out the various problems that were sure to arise with a new design. The early flights showed the fighter had a great deal of promise, but it also showed some of its problems. This didn't cause undue concern, as the purpose of these flights was to find what needed improving. The changes were in some cases almost drastic. The tailpipe was shortened, the leading edge of the wing modified, and the tail was also modified. By 1948, the MiG was ready for mass production. The West gave the fighter the unflattering name of Faggot, which has stayed with the fighter throughout its variants. In the skies over Korea, the MiG-15 came to be a respected adversary. When the MiG-15 entered service, it did so with a number of changes. The canopy framing was changed, which aided visibility, the gun camera was repositioned, the rudder was enlarged and the tailpipe was shortened. One of the most important additions was a set of speed brakes. These were installed on the fuselage at the rear of the plane. They were operated via switches in the cockpit, but also by a control on the flight stick. This option proved useful in combat. The A was a monoplane jet fighter of all-metal design. The flaps had several settings available and were hydraulically operated. The original recommended top speed was Mach 0.92, but it was found that severe buffeting took place at that speed. The problem was with manufacture and the wing dimensions were 4 mm off. Once this error could be fixed, the aircraft was again rated for Mach 0.92. Avionics of the MiG were reasonably rudimentary. A radio, direction finder and radio compass were installed. Missing were IFF, identification friend or foe, radio altimeter and radio marker beacons. If the fighter wanted for avionics, its weapon systems was another matter. Armed with two NS-23 23mm cannons and a single NS-37 37mm cannon, the aircraft packed a strong punch when it was on target. These weapons were not new designs, but they had been developed during the Second World War. The NS-23 was created in 1945 and weighed more than 80 pounds. It could fire 550 rounds per minute and each cannon only carried 80 rounds. The NS-37 weighed in at 330 pounds. It only carried 40 rounds. The MiG-15 had to have ballast added to the nose if ammunition was not carried to keep the balance of the aircraft correct, which posed a problem if most or all of the ammunition was expended in combat as the aircraft became more difficult to fly. Quality of the MiGs varied greatly. This was largely in part to poor production controls. There was a 5-year plan in place, but this dealt only with the total aircraft produced and had no guidelines at all with respect to quality of the finished aircraft. The MiG was seen in ever-increasing numbers, and in 1950 May-Day flyover close to 140 took part. It had several other names over the years, with Aircraft of the Soldier being popular in Soviet service and Jaguar being used by the Hungarians.